The next talk is indeed on proximity tracing in an ecosystem of surveillance capitalism. I like the title very much. It is from Joel Reardon. I hope I pronounced his name correctly. From University of Calgary. Joel, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hello.
Perfect. I don't hear you very well. You are like.
What about now?
Can you please share your slides? Thank you very much.
Yeah, how's that? And they're
Perfect.
advancing and going back?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's very cool animation. Thank you. So, Joel, do you? Okay. So, please, I am very much looking to your talk because this is more so to say insight over the proximity tracing in the total environment around it. So please, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so it is before sunrise here in the Rocky Mountains, so I missed the first part of the program. I have a feeling that there'll be probably some repetition, but I think it'll also dovetail nicely with the talk we just had. So basically, I'm going to talk about how easy it would be for an attacker to actually mount some of these attacks. And this is joint work with my friend and colleague, Paul-Olivier Dehaye. So the idea starts around with these phones, these smartphones that barely existed 12 years ago and now are just in everyone's hands at all times throughout the day. And for these devices, I mean, they're great. They have lots of nice features. They connect to routers and give us access to the internet, and they can connect to cell phone towers to have phone calls as well as internet access, and they receive GPS signals and able to position their location. They're general purpose computers with an array of useful sensors. And it turns out that, this sort of information is also of interest to various ads and analytics companies as well. So there's companies that want to know what cell phone towers you're connected to, or what Wi-Fi router you're connected to, the SSIDs, the MAC addresses, and as well, of course, your GPS locations. These are all actually surrogates for location. The router MAC address, the FTC issued a ruling decreeing that to be a form of location. So the collection is now protected by the location permission on the Android operating system, for example. These sorts of location information is just of use for selling to, these analytics companies who want to track people. Maybe they'll sell this to hedge funds so they can know how long people spend in media market, because if they're spending so many minutes, they can make a guess about profit earnings and then beat the market wisdom, for example, by making large bets. So hedge funds are interested in all this location data, and there are other actors as well. It can be used for advertising and so forth. And the user, of course, doesn't really notice it, that they're talking to all these places on the internet. They're just playing some app, and the app is free. And the reason it's free is because there's just this layer of spyware and tracking software that is written by these third parties that is just included. So if I make an app, I might get paid by one of these companies to include their software, and I just run it, and the user doesn't notice it's running. They're just playing this app. So the reason I say all this is just to sort of set the stage of what I mean by surveillance capitalism, this sort of ecosystem around us where we have all of these apps that are collecting this kind of information already. This is the sort of baseline level. And in a few versions of Android ago, so relatively recently, Android 8 introduced background limits to collecting location. So apps, if you install an app and you don't use it, you've used it once months ago or years ago or whatever, it's still running, and it can start on boot. It can start when you unlock your screen, and it can run code inside the app, including code that gets location. And so just having these apps installed is enough to actually start collecting this sorts of information and collecting it indefinitely. And it became such a problem that, in quoting here from the developer docs, in an effort to reduce power consumption, there's limits to the collection of location imposed on apps, only a few times per hour. So not because it represents this massive invasion into people's expectations of privacy or something like that. No, it was just such a problem, these apps, because all of them are independently collecting and scanning location, causing the phone to do all these GPS calculations. that the battery was getting drained. And so Android put a stop to that and said, now you can only do it a few times per hour when you're not actually using the app. So now flash forward to 2020 and the idea that we'll start using these phones for contact tracing, right? Two phones happen to be next to each other. They can communicate. It means the pockets and purses of the people holding them happen to be near each other. The idea of replicating this strangers on a train type of scenario where there's no way to actually do an effective contact tracing. And the technology to do this, Bluetooth, is used primarily for peripherals and body area networks, this sort of thing. If you've ever been in a car and someone has their phone playing Bluetooth and they step out of the car, it just disappears. It's a perfect medium to do this kind of short range radio communication. And the idea that all these phones are just broadcasting these random messages at all times, and only the phones that happen to be nearby to each other can actually hear these messages. And as the result, these phones just record everything they've heard. And each of these short little utterances represents some actual real world encounter with somebody else. But to the phones themselves, it's just a bunch of anonymous, random, unlinkably anonymous identifiers. So it's just each one of these represents some proximate encounter that occurred, and the phones just keep track of all of them. Now, some of them will correspond to proximate encounters that represent a risk to the user. This is the sort of the part of contact tracing that is meant to thwart the spread of COVID-19. Users can see that they have some amount of risk based on the encounters that they've actually had. So I'm sure this has been covered earlier, but I'll just go through it again. Decentralized and centralized. So the two main models of doing this contact tracing. In the centralized approach, every user registers with some central authority by, for instance, giving a veronymous identifier like their phone number or something like that. Then the authority says, here's all the random things you should say and exactly when to say them. So say this at this time and so forth. And so the authority knows every single identity and everything that they're going to say. So whenever the authority sees a random looking identifier, they actually know exactly who it came from. Now the phones then talk amongst themselves. If one gets infected, they upload everything they've ever heard to the central authority, who is then able to immediately determine who those other people are and then possibly alert them that they may have been exposed. So the privacy problems with this are clear for anyone thinking in terms of privacy. First, we have that the phone uploads everything to the central authority, who is able to know exactly who those people are, map them to actual real humans. This also means that identifiers from people who aren't even sick or won't get sick, for example, are still uploaded. So it's proximate encounters between an affected individual and everyone else, which is not minimizing the amount of information that's collected. And the central authority knows exactly who those people are and when they met. And the second problems have to do with the idea of information self-determinism, which is that when Alice sends a beacon out to Bob, it's now entirely up to Bob whether that gets reported. If Alice decides to uninstall the app, for example, it still will get reported. So Alice has lost control about whether or not the central authority gets to learn this information. And as well, it's also up to the central authority whether to warn Alice. So the central authority presumably doesn't want to have a situation where 99% of the time it's false positives and everyone just stops using the app, because that's also going to be ineffective. So they're going to do some calculation, and it could be the case that Alice just wants to be notified of any risk, but that's sort of not afforded to Alice in this scenario. So the idea to get rid of the central authority is motivated by these problems. And so we have the decentralized solution, the Google Apple model. And in this one, we have, again, these phones, and they're just decide on their own what random things to say. And they do this based on using a pseudo-random generator. So they just have a secret key. They generate the random things to say. They decide when to say it. All the phones still keep track of all the things they've heard. And now they look unlinkably unlinkably anonymous, but there is some trapdoor, some secret key that allows these particular ones to be linked. And if you know the trapdoor, if you know the key, you can link them. If you don't, you can't link them. So these 5 and these 4 came from different phones, but the person who heard them wouldn't know that they all look unlinkably anonymous from that phone's perspective. So all of these phones have their key, and then there's now a health authority that allows these to be uploaded to a database, and then this then gets published. So when a user wants to do a risk calculation, they just request for the confirmed cases, the keys, they get the keys, they can then reconstruct the things that they would have heard from each of them, determine if they've heard any of these, and then figure out that they've had some risky encounters. And they then have an idea of that there's individuals that are responsible. There's 2 unique individuals that have caused these 7 risky encounters, because what happens is by learning these keys, you're now able to link all the identifiers that were before unlinkable. So if you think of it in terms of the NIMIDY slider, which goes from unlinkably anonymous to veronymous, when a user sends their broadcasts out, their contact tracing beacons in a centralized system to other users, it's unlinkably anonymous, but to the central authority, it's veronymous. So they know anytime they see something, know exactly who that came from. And in the decentralized approach, a healthy user or a user that chooses not to upload their key would have unlinkably anonymous identifiers, whereas one who does publish their key goes from unlinkably to linkably. So it's not as far as veronymous, so there's more privacy afforded, but the main difference is that it's now anyone, it's unlinkable to anyone as opposed to veronymous only to the central authority. So that's the main difference between these 2 approaches. So this works over Bluetooth, right? Bluetooth as a radio. The idea being that if 2 phones can talk over Bluetooth, that they're 2 meters apart, or for Americans, about 2 yards. And there's ways that this can be violated, right? Because radio is a public spectrum and we're not actually doing secure distance bounding, right? There's cantennas, there's satellite dishes, there's radio telescopes. There's lots of ways that we can actually violate the sort of distance assumption in radio. And so you can imagine a fake outbreak attack. You have a large energy broadcast of some beacon, and then everyone in the environment gets it, and then everyone thinks they've had a proximate encounter. It's faked, and if it later leads to a at-risk encounter, everyone gets a warning that they may have been exposed. And so the hospital attack, you collect it in one location that's likely to have identifiers that will later lead to an outbreak, and then you rebroadcast it at some industry or something like that that you want to intentionally shut down for because you're foreign intelligence or because you have political motivations or something like that. So you cause a fake outbreak selectively to mount this sort of attack. Another example would be a de-anonymization attack. So here, let's say we have some user Bob, and in the morning he's at his office tower, and then in the evening he's having a beer or coffee, and then at night he's back home. He's going to be traveling around throughout the city, throughout the day. Suppose an adversary was able to collect the beacons from all over the city. Well, they would see that, okay, this one occurred at this particular time, and say they're triangulating it somehow so they are able to get their location as well. And as Bob goes through the town, they're collecting all of these beacons, but they're also linking it to another piece of information, like linking it to location. Now, of course, an adversary who's doing this is going to collect it from everyone. So they're going to have a lot of noise. It won't be clear that this is Bob, for example. But if this key is later published, as the system is working sort of as intended, these identifiers become linkable, but the adversary who collected the identifiers and also associated them to location now knows a location history of a particular person. And this, in a large way, de-anonymizes the person, because the anonymity set of people who sleep at Bob's house and work where Bob works is now going to be much smaller than just the population of the city at large. So when we think of privacy in the system, then we have unlinkably anonymous in the centralized version. So if someone's spying on these broadcasts, you can take what you hear and you can link it to a location, but you'll never be able to link 2 separate broadcasts. They're still going to be unlinkably anonymous unless you're, of course, the central authority. Whereas in the decentralized system, if you are collecting these broadcasts and you're linking them to location, and then they publish their key and you're able to link them. Not only can you link them, you can, in a large step, de-anonymize a person if you believe that having a location history of a person is sufficient to de-anonymize them. And so another attack, or rather, in this case, we have a weapon to do this attack that is not the high gain antenna, not the high energy broadcasting. And that is that the phone itself is the perfect weapon to mount these attacks. The phone has Bluetooth, so it can use Bluetooth to communicate and collect all these codes and store them, annotate it with the time. You has GPS, can know its location, can annotate it with the location, has internet, so it can upload it to some cloud server to have all of these sort of accessed as field reports. Phones can be the perfect weapon to actually mount this attack, collect the information, annotate it with location, send it off to the adversary, and do the de-anonymization attack or having a fake outbreak attack. So here, instead of using high gain antennas, high energy broadcasting, you just have lots and lots of phones everywhere. So if the attacker has access to all of these phones, they would be able to mount this attack by collecting the information in one location and broadcasting it in another. And this attack, which would cause a fake outbreak, and could also be the fact that the phones themselves who are mounting the attack unwittingly are also the ones who receive the notification. So they sort of, in a sense, spread fake information to each other without actually realizing that they're doing this. And the key point is that this attack can be done entirely extra-jurisdictionally, that the attacker doesn't need to have a footprint in the country, it doesn't need to have equipment in the country, as long as it can somehow gain access to people's phones, somehow through this ecosystem of apps that are just running arbitrary code, for example, we can have that the attack is mounted entirely through this through a foreign adversary's country. So there's no real legal system that can thwart it. There's just the phones in one site are collecting the beacons, then another site they're broadcasting them out. And even if we say, well, the beacons are only good for a minute, this attack will still work. As long as we're not actually doing secure distance bounding between the devices, we will have this risk that these beacons can be collected in one location, rebroadcasted out in another. And as well, in the case of our city, we just have phones everywhere. So if the attacker has access to lots and lots of phones throughout a city, they can just use these phones to collect all of this information, annotate it with the location and the time, and effectively build these location paths for everyone around. So another attack that we proposed in our work is, as we call it, the biosurveillance attack. The idea here is that in the same way that GPS creates this ability to get location by creating an ambience of signals, just time broadcasts that are just part of the ether around us, it's not possible to opt out of it. That is, you can say, oh, I just don't use GPS. But if you have equipment that can understand GPS, you really can't stop your phone or something from hearing this information. GPS is just part of the atmosphere around us. So in the same way, if we create an environment, an atmosphere around us of medical information or health information being effectively broadcasted around us, we can also not effectively opt out either. For instance, let's just say there was a phone next to our phone for all times, and this phone was running some code that was just recording everything it heard. Well, this would translate to everything the phone next to it would also hear. And so this information can then be all collected by the adversary and build a dossier of everyone's, all the things that people have heard. And then when the central or the health database then publishes the confirmed keys, they can do a risk calculation on behalf of users and figure, oh, Alice has a 90% chance, right? The idea here is that the code would just be running like a normal contact tracing app, except that Alice may not realize that, for instance, she's running the code herself, or there happens to be a phone next to her. More likely, Alice is the one that has the adversary's code just running it. And Alice may have thought that she's opted out of it entirely, out of the sort of using a contact tracing app, but just the existence of these beacons around her allow anyone who's actually listening to sort of mount these attacks or do the same exact thing, a risk calculation on Alice's behalf. So in effect, instead of needing to have this expensive equipment that has a high footprint that can be conspicuous and obvious, the adversary just needs to somehow get out lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of phones. So how does the adversary do that? Well, the most simplest way, I suppose, is you just take some app, like here's an example, video MP3 converter by Fun Devs. And this app has 100 million installations. And I have a dozen more examples like this with tens of millions of installations as well, running the same sort of code. Now, this app,
Excuse me,
yeah.
5 minutes left.
Thank you. This app, if you have if it's running, and if you've installed it and you don't need to use it because it can run in the background, what it'll do is it'll collect all of the Bluetooth low energy beacons in your environment, as well as MAC addresses of routers and so forth. So this is a packet from, I've added some white space and new lines to make it look prettier and removed the actual identifiers. But if you look at the MAC addresses in the observed field, they have a weird format because they're fake. I injected fake results because I control the operating system when I'm running this app. So I created a fake environment of Bluetooth beacons. And sure enough, it's collecting all the beacons and the MAC addresses and uploading them all to their servers. And this is code running in hundreds of millions of apps. So this is already happening. Before it was the case that we were going to use this kind of information to do contact tracing. Now, they're not actually uploading the codes themselves. So this is not an example of mounting this specific attack, but it's worth pointing out that it's a one-line change of code. Like, they've already collected the MAC address. It would be one more line to also collect the data segment of these beacons. So there's nothing technically hard about this attack, and it's already being done by hundreds of millions of phones. So there are companies that have, in effect, Bluetooth microphones sitting in all over the planet collecting this information before it was being used for contact tracing. And the reason, well, Bluetooth is just another example of location information. So there's companies that are interested in collecting that as well. Now, InLoco Media actually stopped collecting this information earlier this year, but Xmode, the company responsible for that packet, seems to have doubled down in their approach. So if you look at their privacy policy, it's very clear. They say they collect Bluetooth low energy beacons. When do they collect it? When you're using the app and when you're not using the app. So all the time they're collecting this information. And why do they collect it? Among reasons, C, for disease prevention and research, security, anti-crime, and law enforcement. And interestingly, this C was added. So an earlier version of their privacy policy didn't mention health and didn't mention law enforcement. So they seem to have doubled down in my mind for adding this particular reason. Now, to be clear, Xmode is not mounting these attacks. They're not sending the data segment, so it's not possible to do these attacks. But were someone interested to do it, they could also collect this information. And this trivially does the biosurveillance attack of people who are running the code, and it does a de-anonymization attack of the others around them. And then the only missing step is if they wanted to just sell this information, then someone else could do a fake outbreak attack or something like that, or they could do it themselves. And yes, so Xmode is not doing these attacks, but they're busy making money selling location data to the US military, according to a report in Vice and one for the Wall Street Journal that I was involved in writing. So the point is just that we have a system of surveillance capitalism around us. We have phones that are running code, arbitrary code. This is the entire basis of app monetization. We have an entirely open source environment, from the Linux kernel to the Android open source project, running open code, and then this thin veneer of spyware that sits on top of it embedded in these so-called free apps. And as a result, it would be nice that decentralized contact tracing were more anonymous, but from my perspective, the risks in the decentralized model is that the attacker can be anyone on the planet able to do this de-anonymization. So I have a feeling that it could actually be much worse than would have been thought for versus the centralized approach, which is not the sort of initial assumption I had when I was like considering these sorts of systems. So with that, I will finish my talk, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks a lot, Joel. That was a great talk. Just to let you know, a number of European and non-European researchers are now getting together to write a paper about different problems and coming to another conclusion, as maybe we all learn through the research and through experiencing the practice. So one of our speakers, that means the speaker after the next speaker, has time restriction. So I would say we just go for one question, and I think you have a number of on the chat. I see some activities. Lisa, is there any question with raising hand? I don't see one.
No raising hand at the moment.
So that's good that people are shy. Usually it's not in a real workshop, it's not like this, but I also see that a number of people, very respected colleagues of us from Calgary are in the early morning. They are participating. Thanks to all of you, also to Alfred. Hi, Alfred, if you're still there. Anyway, so if there is no question raising hands, I don't see it. So please look at the chat, because there were some questions raised to you and there is some discussion going on. And then thanks a lot again for accepting our invitation, and we